Hello, class. It's Miss Roberts here, and tonight we're going to talk about listening. Why is listening so important in interpersonal relationships and communication in general? Let's find out. So, first, let me go ahead and switch to the slides. Now that I'm at the slides, let's go ahead and talk about it. All right. So, when we're talking about listening, we have to understand what listening is. Now, sometimes when you're trying to confirm if someone's listening to you, you might ask, "Hey, did you hear me? Did you hear what I said?" But the most accurate question would be, "Were you listening to me?" And then you sort of test them if they were listening to you, have them paraphrase for you, or have them parrot back what you said. What is the difference between listening and hearing? So first, listening is the process of receiving and responding to others' messages. But hearing is the physical act of sound waves striking the eardrum, causing vibrations that is transmitted into the brain. So the actual sounds that we hear. So listening refers to the messages that we hear and understand, and hearing is just actually, hey, did you hear the sounds before processing? So when we're talking about listening and its importance to communication, it's the one half of the huge equation. Have you ever misheard someone or misinterpreted what someone told you, and it might have blew up to a big misunderstanding? One of the things that could have stopped that misunderstanding is maybe paraphrasing or saying, "Hey, this is what I heard. This is what I was listening. This is what I was listening that you said. Excuse me. Hey, and this is how I interpreted it." The person can either deny or confirm the message, and maybe the misunderstanding won't happen. So listening is really important just because we want to make sure that we're understanding and interpreting messages, but not only for its content, because remember there are content and relational dimensions to interpersonal communication, but sometimes someone might be wanting to have for you to be a listening ear to them or want support. So there's different types of listening as well. So sometimes you might need to listen just for the content and for understanding, and sometimes there's an emotional layer to listening. So it's really more multidimensional than we give it credit for. But listening, like many other skills in communication, isn't automatic. It's a skill. And with this chapter, we're going to explore how to develop that skill. So if we're trying to figure out if we're listening or what is the quality of our listening, we must first define what is mindless listening versus mindful listening. So mindless listening is when we react to messages automatically and routinely without much mental investment. For example, I'm the type of person that needs the TV, radio, or YouTube on before I can go to sleep. Now, sometimes I might pay attention to the message. I might pay attention to the message before going to sleep, but as I'm drifting off, I'm not necessarily paying attention to what's said. But what's comforting to me is that there's noise in the room. I have a really difficult time falling asleep in silence. So, in that instance, I'm participating in mindless listening. I'm reacting and I'm being soothed by the sounds, but I'm not necessarily grasping the message in that moment. But mindful listening, or when I'm watching a marathon or a marathon on Netflix, I'm actively participating in the content versus when I'm just watching it to fall asleep. And when we are participating in mindful listening, we're giving careful and thoughtful attention and responses to the messages that we receive. And that's the listening that we want, especially if someone's talking to us or need us for support. Okay, so let me move myself a little bit. You know how I like to move myself. All right. And there are also listening styles in different situations where we need to use different types of listening and understanding. So, for example, there is task oriented listening. So, for instance, it might be the listening that you're engaging in now. You're trying to get what information that you can from my lectures in order to do well on the test or to do well on one of the papers that I assigned. So you're doing this because of a job. Or think about your own jobs. What type of listenings do you have to do in the job? For example, in my job, especially in face to face classes, I have to listen for students' concerns, questions. I need to respond with accuracy and compassion. I need to make sure that I'm listening if a student's having trouble and they're a little bit hesitant to tell me if they're having trouble with the lessons. So there's lots of different types of listening that I have to engage in as your instructor. So once we decide, okay, are we listening for task, whether it's for efficiency or accomplishing a job, we might be engaged in listening for relational listening. So I told you earlier that sometimes you listen for content and sometimes you listen for emotional support or emotional sharing. So relational listening is just that, whether it be asking for advice, whether it be being shoulder to cry on, or maybe sharing exciting news. This listening isn't just based on content or what's in the message, but the emotional bonds that are created through that exchange. Next, we have analytical listening. So that's when you attend to the full message before judging. So, for instance, I teach argumentation every summer. And as part of the debates, when I evaluate my students, whether it be for a debate or even for public speaking class, I have to judge the messaging and holistically before I make a judgment of who had the stronger argument, who didn't. So I write down information and I write down what I thought about each argument. And then before I evaluate the whole assignment, I have to make sure to not just nitpick each part, but see, okay, did they have strong arguments? Did they have good presentation styles? Did they use good sources? So I'm listening to the full and entire presentation before making that evaluation. So that's my personal example of analytical listening. You might also use this in deciding conflicts. So say if two of your friends are in a conflict and they both tell you their side of the story, you might be hesitant to jump to a full conclusion until you hear both messages or both sides of the story. And in that case, you're engaging in analytical listening. Then there's also critical listening. So, for example, throughout the entire exchange, you're evaluating the messages, versus with analytical listening, you're waiting to the very end of the message to make your evaluation. So, say for instance, a political or presidential debate. Usually, we would probably analyze each person's responses in that exchange versus at the end. Now, of course, they do a recap at the end, but in the middle of the debate, you might be like, okay, good points, not so good points, as the debate is going on. So when we're in that exchange, we're participating in critical listening. Move myself again. But listening isn't the most easiest thing to do, especially if you're not necessarily, if you don't understand what good listening is, or we have poor listening habits, and I'm going to talk about a lot of those later. But then there's also actual barriers to listening. For example, there might be information overload. So, say if you're getting multiple sources at the same time or conflicting information at the same time, and you don't have the time to process what you're hearing, then it may impede on your ability to listen and hear and digest the message. You may also have personal concerns. Say if you're in the middle of a lecture and you're hungry or you're sleepy or you had an argument with a family member or a partner, and a lot of those things a lot of the situations or thoughts are with you in the classroom. So those personal concerns, even though you might want to listen, you're a little bit distracted by those personal concerns. Then you also might have rapid thought. So in the process of listening, you might be having rapid thoughts or rapid reactions as the listening process happens. So for instance, say you're trying to interpret or understand a message very quickly, and because you don't have time to process those thoughts, or you might have be thinking in the middle of that listening, it might impede or be a barrier in the listening process. So try to clear your mind and try to absorb the message as much as possible. And then you have noise. So you might just have actual noise from outside the room, inside the room, that you can't physically hear what's going on. So you have to wait till you're in a quieter space so you can focus on hearing the actual message. Next up, we have poor listening habits and how to avoid them. Now, I won't lie, I have some of these poor listening habits as well, but in teaching this class, I am working on becoming better as far as becoming a better listener. We might do some or we might do all of these. But if you do, don't be ashamed. It's like any other communication skill. You have to know some of your poor habits in order to fix them. So let's begin. So first we have pseudo listening. So we have the prefix pseudo and listening, fake listening. So I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where someone's talking to you to your face, kind of touchy if this happens, or if you're on the phone with someone and they just kind of go on and on and on, and you're like, uh huh, uh huh, uh huh, yeah, uh huh, okay. And then they ask you, hey, what did I say? And you don't know because you were pseudo listening. Hmm. Sometimes I've done that before, especially when someone goes on and on, but I'm working on it. Next up, we have stage hogging. So that's when people are only interested in expressing their ideas and don't really care about what someone else has to say. So here's the deal. So when you're in a conversation, there's an exchange, and we understand that. But some people, or people in some situations, might engage in that exchange just to talk about themselves. So they'll listen to you just to be a part of that exchange, but they just want to talk about what they want to talk about. That makes sense. We might have been in those situations where, hey, they keep putting the conversation back to them all of a sudden. Why is that? It's because of stage hogging. Next up, we have selective listening. So that's when people respond only to the parts of the message that interest them and rejecting everything else. So say we have two people in exchange, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and then on Saturday we're going to get some pizza, blah, blah, blah. And then the person might be pseudo listening, but when they heard Saturday pizza, ooh, when? Their ears perk up. They're ignoring the other parts of the message, but then, ooh, pizza? Now I'm all ears. So in selective listening, you pick parts that you like and reject, or don't pay attention to the parts that you don't want to. Or when you get caught doing these things, you fill in the gaps. And I am guilty of doing that because I was pseudo listening and I have to save face. So when we fill in the gaps, that's when people think they remember a whole story and manufacture information. They retell what they listen to, try to fill in the gaps to give the impression, notice the word, impression, that they got it all. Instead of just admitting, hey, can you repeat this one more time? Or, hey, I didn't get that part. They try to fake it so they make it Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's better to listen the first time. Next, we have insulated listening. I like to create a metaphor of the la 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 type of listening. So there is listening that's not listening, or you're talking to them and they kind of mentally block out whatever you said because they don't want to deal with it, or they don't want to hear you, so they just kind of tune out on purpose. So listening kind of happens by accident, or just kind of happens when that conversation ebbs and flows, right? Or they're just really bad listeners. But with insulated listening, they're ignoring you while you talk on purpose. Dig that. Then we have defensive listening. That's when someone takes an innocent comment as a personal attack. Say you have two people. One person's trying on some clothes. Hey, how's this look on me? Oh, it looks cute. Cute? You're supposed to say beautiful, gorgeous, breathtaking. Just cute? I guess you're gorgeous. Oh, thank you. So in defensive listening, you're kind of looking for attacks and a message where there are none. Last but certainly not least, ambushing. So that's when the listener listens carefully to gather information to attack the listener later. I don't know how many of you have either watched or watch reality shows. As a person who has watched one or two reality shows in my day, this happens all the time. So I like to nickname this, personally, I like to nickname this reality show listening. So, for instance, you have one person in the show befriend another person in the show, and one tells a secret to the other person, and then later on in the series, that information comes back out in a flashback or an argument. So when that person told the other person information in confidence, they didn't know that it was going to be used against them later. So when you use personal sensitive information, or when one uses personal and sensitive information just to attack someone later, that is ambushing listening. And that's really bad. All right, let me move myself a little bit, as I always do. Next, there are several parts to listening, or several components to listening that we want to explore. Several layers, right? So we have the physiological act of listening. In order to listen, you have to hear the information and process it. But I challenge you, just for a second, sit in the room in silence real quick. Okay. So what did you hear? So in this instance, when I stop talking, I hear my laptop processing of the fan of my laptop whirling around. What did you hear? Did you hear people in your house? Did you hear your laptop whirling around? Did you hear a siren outside? Now, here's the difference between just hearing information and attending to the information. Now that we've stopped and heard our surroundings, now you can't not hear it anymore because now we've paid attention to it. So first you have to hear the information, and then you have to choose whether to pay attention to the information or not. But next we have to understand what we're listening to. So for example, I only speak English. I want to learn another language one day, but for now I only speak English. So if I want to watch a movie in a language other than my own, I have to have subtitles. Reason being, I'm able to hear what they're saying, and I can pay attention as long as I want to, but until I get the know-how of the rules of the language, then I don't understand it. I need English subtitles to help me out. Another part of understanding that, or another term and understanding that we need to know is listening fidelity. And that's the congruence between understanding what the sender is trying between understanding and what the sender is trying to communicate. So for instance, some misunderstandings are because of lack of listening fidelity. So you want to make sure that what you understand is what the sender was trying to say to you. Then we have remembering. So, of course, we can attend to the sounds, listen to the sounds, attend to the sounds, even understand what the sounds mean, but do have to remember this, right? So, there's only so much information you have to remember or have to digest. And if so, in order to help retain information, you want to repeat the information, make sure that it's stored or interact with the information, write it down, type it, and rehearse the information if it needs to be retained. Then you have to decide if you have to respond. So, do you just sit there and passively listen, or do you want to give observable feedback? Observable feedback. So, to show attentiveness, having an eye contact, appropriate facial expressions for what they're talking about, answering questions, and exchanging ideas. And that which shows the communicators that you're listening to them, both verbally and non-verbally. And just like most communication endeavors, listening is transactional. Next up, we have silent listening. Ooh. So sometimes listening, you're able to give an exchange back and forth. You shouldn't interrupt each other, but people do. But silent listening is being attentive to the message, but but not offering any verbal feedback. So, for example, it might not be super appropriate to give a verbal response, or you're trying to stay silent to show respect and or to absorb the information or help solve problems. So sometimes silent listening may be helpful if it's not necessarily appropriate to give verbal feedback, or you are being attentive and supportive to someone who might be in distress and just giving listening ear and not necessarily giving feedback until they're done communicating what they need to communicate. So it is useful. All right. So maybe you can see me here. I'm just going to be in the middle of the information here. Hello. All right. So then we have questioning. So questioning has several purposes, and you probably didn't know all these purposes until you saw this slide. So let's go over them together. So we use questions to clarify meanings. Then there are several types of questions. For example, open-ended questions can elicit a variety of responses, and sometimes that's helpful, especially when you need to know about nuance or to need to know someone's opinion, or sometimes you need simple closed-ended questions, yes, no, or maybe type of answers. Questions can offer people to discover new things, to ask follow up questions, to engage in exchange, or gather more facts and details. But you want to make sure that you're asking questions properly and not ambushing people with questions, just like we talked about in the last slide. So you don't want to trap the speaker with your questions. You don't want to make statements with the questions. So if you're going to make a statement, make a statement. You don't have to use the inflection like this, like everything is a question, but it's actually a statement. You don't want to carry hidden agendas if you're trying to gain understanding. Some people might see through that. You don't want to ask leading questions, so the correct answer is within the question. You want to make sure that you're honest and have clear intentions with your questioning. And you don't want to make assumptions while questioning someone else. You may have heard the term paraphrasing before, maybe in English or writing class. When you paraphrase in that writing context, you are taking the author's work and you're putting in your own words, and of course, citing the source to give them credit. So, in the context of relational or content listening, you are parroting back what you think the messenger heard. Excuse me, what the messenger said. So, for instance, if someone says something, you are putting what their message was in your own words and then replying back to them just to check to say, hey, do we have the listening fidelity that we talked about earlier? Or because you parroted back the message to them, they can say, yes, that's what I mean, or no, that's what I don't mean, and can clarify. So there are two ways or two different types of paraphrasing that we can take a part of. We have factual information and personal information. So it's one of those instances where are we paraphrasing for content listening purposes? Or are we paraphrasing for relational listening purposes? So with paraphrasing factual information, we want to use a questioning tone, state the facts, and paraphrase instructions, directions, and decisions. Versus paraphrasing for personal or relational purposes, we want to listen to feelings, listen to wants. We want to be supportive, use nonverbal communication. And of course, we can still talk about and ask about facts, but we want to make sure that we're mirroring the emotional content or emotional communication or nonverbals as well as the factual. Next up, we have empathizing. So we talked about empathy in previous chapters, but we are putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, which can definitely help with interpersonal communication, especially if someone needs us or we're in a conflict and we want to make sure that not only are we advocating for our side, but we are also understanding the other person's side as well. So when we do listen for empathy purposes, we identify with the speaker's emotions and perceptions. So you're not just parroting back what they're saying, you're putting yourself in their shoes. And we're not necessarily evaluating or arguing with them at that point, but we're trying to support them in that moment of empathy. So you want to make sure in those exchanges that you don't deny their right to their feelings. If you want to challenge some of their feelings, maybe pick later on in the conversation or maybe offer alternatives, but sometimes you have to use your judgment. Is it appropriate or is it not appropriate? If someone's clearly upset, then you can offer those devil's advocates later. You don't want to minimize the significance of the situation either, especially since you're not in their shoes. But of course, if you want to offer alternatives or alternative perspectives, you can, but just know when is the right time to do it. You don't want to be the stage hog and focus on yourself if you're trying to put yourself in another person's shoes. What you can do alternatively is maybe talk about when you're in that similar situation, maybe to offer some perspective, but you don't want to focus the conversation on yourself. And don't rain on the speaker's parade. So don't talk about how it could be so much worse or say, oh, yeah, that's terrible and bad. You want to make sure to balance and offer that emotional support without making them feel worse because they're coming to you to help them feel better if possible, you know? So, next, another level of empathetic listening is supportive listening. So, in this case, not only are you putting yourself in the other person's shoes, but you're more agreeing with them and in solidarity with that person. So when you are in supportive mode of listening, you're agreeing with them, you're offering help to them, praise, reassurance, and maybe offering listening as diversion. Like, for example, you might say if there's someone's having a bad day, and in addition to these types of listings or types of strategies up here, you might want to divert that depressive mood or episode by saying, hey, let's go get some ice cream, or hey, let's go to a movie, or hey, let's watch a reality TV show and gossip about the characters. So to offer that diversion from what they're going through as support. So you want to make sure that it's sincere. You want to make sure that the other person is in a space where they can accept the support. Sometimes they can't, but just offer to be there when they're ready. And just making sure to focus on what can they do right now to feel better, or some of the actions they can do right now versus in the past. So when we're evaluating or doing evaluative listening, like we talked about before, so you're putting a judgment on what the speaker says. Sometimes that might be useful. Say, for instance, you are evaluating what someone says for a job interview, or you're on the first date and you have to evaluate, okay, based on what this person says, do we want to go out or not? So there is places for evaluative or evaluating listening. But if you are listening to evaluate and giving evaluations, you want to make sure, if appropriate, to give constructive criticism. So you want to make sure that you're not putting someone down, but noticing some things they need to work on and help and have them help in the future. Finally, we have advising. So I am the queen of unsolicited advice, but after teaching this chapter, I know when to slow my roll. I'm the oldest and I'm an instructor, so I'm usually in this role of giving directions all the time. So I have to learn how to turn it off. But when do we know when giving advice is helpful or not? So it's not helpful when you don't offer the best suggestion. It might be the best suggestion to you, but it might not be the best suggestion in their circumstance. Sometimes someone doesn't want to be the advice recipient, so you have to respect that. Even though you might have some good ideas, they have to be able to receive those good ideas. Or someone might be super enthused to get advice, and then if it goes awry, they could just blame the advice giver except themselves. They can deflect responsibility, and you don't want that either. Some people don't want advice, especially with matters that are very personal. So if they're not ready to accept it, don't give it. Okay. All right. So we reviewed several parts of listening. We determined what listening versus hearing was, different types of listening, different barriers to listening that can involve us or outside sources. Then we talked about the different errors of listening, where we have to make sure we don't fall into these particular habits, or if we do, actively work on them. And then we also talked about the different types of listening in different contexts. So if you have any questions, of course, let me know. And I hope that after this lecture that you now are aware of how to be a better listener. I know I have as I taught it. If you have any more questions, please let me know. All right, thanks for joining me again, and I'll see you next time. Bye.